Autism is a complicated thing because it affects every single element of how a person is formed, what their senses take in, and then what they do with that information thereafter. So, with autism, not a single part of your existence goes according to the statistical typicality for a human being. Let's talk about it. Autism is one of many possible consequences to the situation wherein the brain and body are overheated or inflamed during the period of sensory system formation. So, the bit where the baby is forming in gestation and the organs and nerves and electrical flows of the senses are being built. If there are environmental and genetic factors leading to overheating and general chaos while this is happening, you get those systems coming out differently structured or wired than you typically see in humans. So sometimes in these situations, it's the ocular systems that build or wire differently, and you end up with a problem with the sense of sight and some form of blindness. Maybe it's the aural systems, and then you're deaf. Or in some cases, is actually a difference to the structure or wiring of the system underlying the sense of resonance. And then you're autistic. Yay. The sense of resonance is the sense of feeling with, of triggered instinct and reflex. It's the intuitive bodily awareness of things, people, trees, places, the knowing that is not through any learned understanding of signs and rules, but is automatic and embodied, instinctive, intuitive. If you want to really get into the detail, the sense of resonance derives from the frequential echo of your own frequential emissions superimposed on whatever they bounce off of in the surrounding context to echo back to you. Those vibrations, upon impact on the body, shimmer the fascia. The fascia is the webbing that runs through and around every part of the body, giving all the components and accordingly the whole its constituent shape and definition. And this shimmer of the fascia, this vibration throughout the fabric, results in a continuous input to the brain of the frequential pattern of all that surrounds the environment and the self from which the original frequency emitted. That is to say, the feel of the world and the self at the same time. Vibes. So, anyway, in the absence of this topographical map of vibes of the world, without the code for a bunch of automatic moves when triggered by given stimuli, the autistic human is quite lost from the get go, confused about what is around, what any of it has to do with each other or the individual themselves, and indeed what they themselves even are, and what's even going on here at all, and how are they supposed to make moves like everybody else seems to be doing. It's quite impossible, actually, until one learns to replace this absent map with an artificial one built from signs, conventions, and logic and observation and analysis. Neurotypicals, to a lesser extent, have to build such a map too as they grow up. No one can make it through life on vibes and reflex alone. But for neurotypicals, the information they acquire about how the world works doesn't have to stand in place of a totally absent data set. It supplements the vibes and reflexes map they already have. So it's orders of magnitude lighter because there's already existing intuitionally accessible data and embodied reflexes covering like 60% of their day-to-day actions. Non-autistic people go around feeling pulled to this, repelled from that, urged in general. And this reflex and action triggering sensation fills in like 60% of the plot of their lives. They didn't just land here in this Rubik's Cube of a flesh container and be suddenly seemingly tasked with authoring a stop motion life animation for 80 to 100 odd years, starting off with zero context on anything. To put it a different way, while everybody else is frolicking through life, feeling innately like they belong on this planet and getting to perform a great deal of their existential actions on autopilot, us autistics are muddling through each nanosecond of every situation by situation, crossing learned rules against the random winds of chaos and other people's actions, and spending our lives racked with confusion, busy trying to make sense of what's around and choose a course of action every single second of the waking day. And we're handling all of this by continuously downloading metric tons of information about anything and everything, from books, from conversation, from observation and comparative analysis, mostly this one, in the hopes of making it through each specific encounter and over time building a rule set to get through every type of life experience with outcomes that don't suck. It's a lot, actually. And then, even when you do get there, in terms of broadly figuring out what's going on, not only is there always some bizarre exception to the rule that yet sneaks up on you and trips you up dramatically, now and then, or always, it's also true that even when you don't trip dramatically, you're still going to, technically speaking, get it wrong. You're still going to give yourself away somehow, because you'll trigger people's uncanny valley feeling basically every time you act, by one way or another doing, via your stringent calculations and contextual data, or eventually via your artificially self-built reflexes. You'll still end up doing something weird, something other than what was expected, something other than the default resonance-based reflex action would typically be for that context. Something instead of a smile, something instead of the words that would normally be said. So your life is defined by, one, a continuous anxiety that you don't know what's going on and you need to keep gathering and computing data to make it make sense. And two, a voracious consumption of information and a truly wild degree of processing that information. This gluttony for know-how is both on account of the continuous need to learn and analyze and rationalize in order to make each given choice to move one's carcass through existence, but then also it's because it becomes a stim very quickly and eventually, a thing of very intense or trance-like enjoyment, enjoyable occupation, a source of euphoric relief and satisfaction that makes you feel alive and held together in one place. This is all autistics live for. And yes, I am essentially saying that all artistic hobbies are just learning in different guises. Fight me outside about it if you don't agree. In addition to the existential confusion and addiction to learning, your life is typified by continuous social chaos because you make choices by processing the overtext of situations in light of previously assembled, or sometimes in real time, then and there assembling principles or rules. And sometimes your principles and rules are actually logically flawed or missing data that you don't yet have, and so they're bunk. And other times it's that the real information about the situation wasn't in the overtext of what people were saying or doing, it was in the vibes. So you end up at that warehouse, at that party that definitely concludes in you being the victim of a crime, or you end up taken advantage of in those ways, or you end up inadvertently making an enemy for life because you say the thing that seems harmless and certainly true based on overtext data and principles, but it turns out if you knew the vibes, you wouldn't even touch that subject with a barge pole to begin with. So also your life is usually typified by your other sensory systems being haywire. It's either that in the absence of resonance data streaming into the brain, the other senses send more to take up the vacancy, or just that all that glutamate and cortisol fallout from continuously thinking and learning to compensate for what is missing leaves autistic people perpetually overactivated, or something else. But whatever the case, you see or hear or taste or feel more than is necessarily or functionally ideal, and sometimes you experience this excess as excess. Too much feedback from that sweater to the tactile processing systems, and it's itchy in a way that you want to die over. And the overhead light in the room is not only too bright, it makes your teeth hurt somehow. And sometimes you experience the excess of incoming signal as numbed out hyposensitivity, where sensation doesn't really come through in full detail or at all. So you can't quite hear the conversation, but the person talking to you is right in front of you. So that can't be right. And yet, so you just smile and hope for the best. Or it's like there's plastic between you and the person trying to touch your skin. So you can sort of feel it, but also not quite. And certainly no electricity. Anyway, you typically get two categories of responses to this clusterfuck of a situation from autistic people. Group ones hide in their own worlds as far as possible, and group twos become obsessed with understanding everything about everything and building the ultimate system for life making sense. All my autistic friends are group ones, and I'm very jealous of them as a group two, but they are in turn rather jealous of me. My envy of them stems from the fact that they've gotten to spend chunks of time away from the confusion of the real world and have known for most, if not all of their lives, the euphoric joy of understanding how a thing, their special thing, works And so much so that they experience a multidimensional satisfaction, joy, or at least trance-like focus every time they think about it. A world of their own they can just crawl into and disappear. And they get to spend most of their time experiencing that. And even when they occasionally have to come back to the real world to do real world things that allow them to, peaceably spend most of their time thinking about whatever it is they do so love to think about, they're usually coming back out here to do something that relates to the thing they love to think about. As in, they can usually get by well enough and making spoils of whatever they do be thinking about, get the money and the genius designation that allows them freedom, by and large, from societal norms to disappear for most of the time into their favorite ideas. This is a glib and reductive and somewhat exclusionary telling of their lives, but we must be brief. And also, grass is greener, envious eyes are always a little bit like this in their perspective, so allow. But anyway, on the other side, they envied that the thing I decided or was dragged into spending, double PhD depths of knowledge chasing about people, and why they do what they do, and then also self and why I do be doing what I do, might have initially meant that I didn't get to retreat from the confusion of the world ever, but it has paid some key dividends, most especially in the last year when I finally learned enough about everything for it all to click into place. Dividends like I spend almost all my time quite happy and mentally at peace, and I greatly enjoy the company of other humans, and I'm broadly agreed to be charismatic and very likable. The quite happy mentally thing is on account of having put everything I've learned about myself and how I'm composed into designing a daily routine and overall life structure that means I'm optimally cared for both physically and mentally in light of my specific needs and circumstances. And the enjoy people and unbeloved thing is because you really can learn enough improv, psychology, sociology, anthropology, biochemistry, history, and pop culture to build a cognitively held set of social reflexes equal to, I'd argue superior even, what neurotypicals have through resonance and intuition. So, I see what they're saying. Anyway, I should add now that when I said the conundrum of a lack of sense of resonance will either create hiders or questing to understanders, I didn't say that there are no other ways to be autistic. That would be a ridiculous claim, not least because, of course, there are plenty of us in the autism nation who lack the neuronal structure and machinery for high intensity, non-stop cognition, and therefore don't get the option of building a sufficiently detailed replacement data set of what the world and existence is and how one should engage with everything one encounters in the environment. At the same time as I acknowledge them and their full membership of Autism Nation, I'm aiming here to talk about the experience of autism to the extent that I understand it. And since my entire experience of autism is fundamentally founded on learning information as a replacement for the sense of resonance, an autistic experience defined by whatever happens where there is a lack of a sense of resonance not replaced by learning is quite unknown to me and maybe unfathomable. I would be very curious for that to change. But I also just had to go ahead and start this podcast with what I do understand so far, or I would literally never begin. Anyway, while I'm at it, the final subgroup of autistics I will highlight are those who eventually give up on people and society, who use their maps of understanding the world to build economic security and material safety and routine enough to enjoy their peace and spend as little time as possible with other human beings and spend most of it with their favorite subject and ideas. They get burned one too many times and focus on excluding people as far as practicable and are happy to let their map and their tool sets around social atrophy and usually be replaced by richer depth in another area of learning. Shout out, I get it, I do get it. Now, in one way, us learn our way into a replacement map autistics can end up almost any shape of person, of course, because there is a near infinite range of learnable information out there with which you can construct a principal set to parse the data you observe from the world. There are autistic people who learn about the exquisite systems of material logic that underlie trains and root systems and not only bask in thinking about the intricacies of that, but will take principles derived from the world of trains, principles responsible for the good outcomes that total up the beauty of that system to them, and apply those to their lives. The thing, though, is that even if a train's autistic learns via that, and a penguin's autistic learns via that, and a gardening autistic via that, they will end up with quite a few similarities. And the reason for that is because there is so much overlap between the design principles of all things in nature. And accordingly, the same is true for man-made things, because we built everything from copying nature. So think all that golden ratio stuff as an example. So if you follow the logic for why a good metro system works, and the same for why a good flower is excellent in all the ways that it is, you will end up in more or less the same place. So while we're all very unique snowflakes decorated in the specific spirit of our favorite subjects, there's also an uncanny similarity to autistics that you can always see if you know what to look for anyway, whether you're dealing with a Luna Lovegood or a Spock or a Leslie Knope or a Snoop Dogg or what's the girl from Legally Blonde. And I still think the weirdest ones are those witchy little shapeshifters of us who picked people as our special subject. But anyway, a special subject, by the way, is likely just the first thing that introduced you to the cycle of curiosity, learning, and satisfaction, and thereafter became the thing you know the densest amount of information about, and likely also use the underlying logic as a rule set for life. One thing I also want to touch on is the high support, low support needs dichotomy and conversation that's currently in the zeitgeist. So obviously, the more intelligent you are, which is to say, the more it happens to be that the circuits running between your prefrontal cortex and hippocampus are wired to just selfishly take up all the energy, the more you can outrun the consequences of your autistic lack of intuition and reflex by continuously figuring out or working around what you weren't born automatically knowing. So those whose brains aren't wired for learning at the other end of the spectrum will neither be able to vibe their way into automatically doing the right, or at least species typical action in a given situation, nor learn to manually perform the next best action either. And so will require a lot of support in the form of other people stepping in to do for them what they can't. The more one is able to learn, the more support should be split between doing for them and helping them build that replacement map or data set so they can do for themselves. And when one is able to learn to an unusual extent, autism is still a disability in the context of a world built for neurotypicals, and not only needs support with acquiring and refining that replacement data set, they also need support with managing the consequences of really abusing the brain's learning system in ways it's not necessarily built for. Think cyclically overheating the brain into burnout and shutdown and nonstop flooding the body with cortisol, because that's the chemical aftermath that follows use of the brain's analytical system, leading to everything from chronic illness and cancers and joint damage to just good old IBS and perpetual brain fog. And all because you're having to learn to compensate for everything you should bodily know. So anyway, let's talk about favorite and least favorite things about the autistic experience. My favorite is, I think it's great that we all love show and tell so much, because it's such a wonderful antidote to the loneliness of being alone in your own universe. This sport of exposing it to other people, getting to have people bear witness, say, look what I saw today. And you know what's especially cool about my getting to see this today? Insert all this lore, etc. And when there is interest on the other side, when you can see the resonance between what you're thinking and what you're trying to express, what they now know, and in that moment, you're not alone with your thoughts, you're not alone with your universe, you're getting to show them to someone else and show that person why you love your universe, or why you don't, or why it scares you, and have someone else back you up. Oh, that feeling. But anyway, on the other side, my least favorite thing that I think autistics have in common is the bullying experience, and maybe the health issues. The bullying experience, because there has always seemingly been disproportionate consequences to jarring people with the sharp contrasts of your weird actions as compared to what they expected or what typically happens. And sometimes these consequences are physical violence, and sometimes it's the pain of exclusion. But yeah, it's a tie between that and the health stuff, because, like I said earlier, our internal physical bodies are on fire as a consequence of that nonstop high cognition activity. All that computing is why our cortisol levels are through the roof by default, and all else that comes with that, from allergies and gut issues to the cancers and the joint erosion. But on that note, I would say that personally speaking, now that I understand it in full from the bioelectric and historical and genetic and epigenetic origins to all that it could mean in my life in terms of potential and all that it has meant in the world throughout time, like when I think of all the autistic people throughout the ages who've done extraordinary things and lived so beautifully, I know that I wouldn't trade it in. I wouldn't give it up if given the option now. I think I'm glad I'm this way. I think that what we get to derive from the universe on account of consuming so deeply is quite wonderful, not to talk of what we make of all that thereafter. So anyway, that's the autistic mind. Have a nice day.